Yeah, so I was just, usually we start with the vision behind Graybeards, and it's really just a podcast for the Oracle community, or really just the tech community. Oracle Graybeards are the people that we've tend to interview, and other technical professionals, so we can share our war stories and experiences from the tech world. And really, the idea is to provide a space for mentorship and knowledge sharing, and also to bring some humor to the technical community. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Kerry Osborne, a serial entrepreneur, and he has an impressive track record founding two successful companies. ThinkSpark, actually, I hadn't heard of ThinkSpark before I read Kerry's bio, and Encatech. Encatech is the company that Rob and I both work for, actually Accenture, but we still use the brand Encatech. And these companies grew really big, $100 million. That's amazing annual revenue, and now acquired by Accenture. And if that wasn't enough, Kerry co-founded Gluent and serves as CEO and chairman of the board, and is now leading Google's database black belt team. And Kerry's innovative approach to problem solving is well known, and has earned him a reputation as a trailblazer in the industry, and is also sought out speaker at technical conferences. So it's our pleasure to have Kerry Osborne with us today.
That's an awful lot of really nice words. I appreciate it. I guess I can't argue with too much of it, but yeah, I've been fortunate to be part of some really good teams, which you two are part of now, right? So,
well, you built the teams, because I remember, I can't remember if it was an interview that you had done a while back where you had stated something to the effect that you had interviewed thousands of DBAs, right? So you have a knack for finding the right people. You want to say something about that?
Well, sure. It's yeah, I mean, after you've been around for a few decades, the numbers can start to add up. But yeah, there are lots and lots of people that I've talked to over the years, and quite a few that we've hired. So but yeah, it's all about the team, man. It's the credit that we get for the success we've had, a lot of it has to do with the people that we've surrounded ourselves with. And so, I always tried to find people that were smarter than me, that, were better at whatever than me. And so, part of the interview process, a few things about the interview process. One was trying to find creative problem solvers. That was the number one goal. So after a few years, we got pretty good at being able to identify the people that were going to be good at that. It took a while, though. It took quite a while, actually. And but eventually we stopped doing sort of the traditional, looking for a guy with a specific experience we were looking for, and really more started looking for people that had the ability to solve problems, that had a good technical background, and a certain amount of experience. That this 10,000 hours sort of myth that we hear about sometimes, but really you need a good background really to get to the point where you're world class at anything, right? And that was an important part of it. But really it was asking, how do you, tell me about something you're working on. And, very open-ended kind of an interview process, right? Tell me something you're working on. And, it didn't matter what it was. What I really wanted to understand was, how did it turn out? Did it turn out well, or did it not turn out well? It didn't really matter if it turned out well or not. But what I really wanted to understand was, how did you think about solving that problem? And what data did you collect? And how long did you spend in the collection of data before you started thinking about what the solution might be? And how did you think about the potential solutions that you might have? And how did you decide on which one you were going to, work on first? And then how quickly did you, if that one wasn't the answer, how quickly did you switch to, the next most likely option? And so over the years, you get to a point where you have a pretty good idea of how that works. And the way you get to that idea is you sit next to people like yourselves and Tanel and Karen Morton and, Carlos Sierra and some of these people, Mauro Pagano, and you get to watch the process that they go through, and they've got a hard problem to solve and how they solve it. And, Tanel's a good example. Tanel's one of those guys who talks a lot about his methodical approach to solving problems. I never seen anybody that was less methodical.
Yeah.
You know, and that's not really a total truth, because he is methodical, but I actually started reading, you know, papers on psychology and problem solving. And one of the techniques that is used by fire departments and FAA is a modified version of a methodical approach. A methodical approach would be, I'm going to spend a bunch of time collecting data. I'm going to come up with some potential solutions. I'm going to start with the most likely, and I'm going to work my way through that. And if that doesn't work, I'm going to work through my way through the second one, the third one, the fourth one. There's a modified version of that people like firefighters who don't have a lot of time, you know, when you're attacking a fire, you have to make a decision very quickly. So you don't have time to be extremely methodical. You've got to be really good at what you do. And you've also got to be able to have enough experience to know what the most likely candidates are. And so there's this thing called a modified methodical approach, basically, where the guys will immediately jump to what they think is the most likely, you know, reason for or approach to how to solve a problem. And if that doesn't work, very quickly go to the next one, very quickly go to the next one. And if the first two or three don't pan out, then you back up and you start being very methodical. But because you've got lives on the line, you don't have time to start that from the very first. And most of the time, people that are really experienced can be very good at that. And guys like Tennell, you know, he knows who the most likely suspects are, you know, for an awful lot of problems, because he's seen so many different problems and solved so many problems. But it looks very non-methodical when you sit next to him and watch him, because he just bounces all over the place.
I tend to just start writing code.
Yeah. Well,
And I've studied a little bit of that too. And I think they call it chunking. Like if you watch a chess grandmaster, is they just recognize the pattern. They don't look at every single piece. It's like, this is the pattern. I've seen it before.
Yep.
So.
Yeah. Those guys are interesting too. I actually have a guy that I worked with on my very first job was a grandmaster chess player, and he beat Boris Spassky once.
Oh, wow.
But he beat Boris Spassky when Boris Spassky was playing like 12 different games all at the same time. And he was the only guy of the 12 or however many it was simultaneous games that were going on that won. Everybody else lost. So, you know, anyway, but he can claim that, right? So that was pretty cool.
So Kerry, I wanted to ask a question. I saw somewhere where you had started Oracle very, very many years ago, and Oracle version 2 with VAX VMS and as a Fortran developer. And then you sort of got into system administration. But I remember a war story, and I'm just going to see if set process / priority rings a bell.
Yes, it does. I'm very fortunate in my career. I never crashed a production database.
Okay.
So this story may be an exception to that. I don't know if Oracle was even involved in that particular story, but I was doing development work, and it was back in the days. Somehow I'd convinced the company was an oil company, Standard Oil, so they don't even exist anymore. They got bought by BP, the British petroleum company. But anyway, I convinced them to let me to work from home. And back then I had a 300 baud modem, and then I upgraded to a 1200 baud modem. So wow, if you can imagine, yeah. So you type and you wait, type and you wait. So anyway, I was working one night late, and I was trying to get this program to run, and I somehow managed to work my way into a system administrator kind of a position. So I had privileges to do whatever I wanted on the box. And so my thing was running really slow, and I was getting a little hacked off at it. And I looked, and there was a bunch of batch jobs running. And I'm like, well, I know how to fix that. I'll just jack my priority up on my program, and I can run through a bunch of iterations real quick. So that worked fine until I got into an infinite loop, and the thing hung up. And back in those days, the time slicing algorithms on the machines were not very robust like they are now. So basically, once it got in that loop, it was burning 100% of the CPU, and there was no CPU for somebody else to log on. And as modems were tended to do back then. I got disconnected, trying to control C out of the program. I got disconnected and I couldn't get logged back in because I couldn't get any CPU for a log on prompt to pop up. So when I got in the next morning, the real system administrators were there waiting for me. I'd filled up the disk with the log file. It was spitting out, error messages to the log file, and eventually crashed the machine because it ran out of disk space. So anyway, that's the closest I came to ever crashing a database. I don't believe there was a database involved in that particular incident, but
I've crashed production databases once. I took the State Department down. The statute of limitation is up. Did you know in Oracle 7.0 you could truncate sys's tables?
No, but it doesn't surprise me.
Yeah, I think
someone gave me a script to run.
Go ahead, tell your story. But I do want to remind Kerry that most of the war stories, the statute of limitations are up, or we changed the names to protect the guilty. So
exactly. Yeah, that was a very, very long time ago. So.
Yeah, Oracle 7.0 senior DBA gave me a script to run and said log on as a DBA to run it. So I logged on as sys. First thing it did was truncated the tables of whoever logged on. Valuable lesson. Read the script before you run it.
Yes, exactly.
So Kerry, another question here. You've always come across as to me as calm, but I'm sure you've been in situations where everyone around you was in a panic. So I like to borrow the term stress inoculation training from the military, but what's your secret? Can you share some war stories with us that would exemplify the importance of attitude under stress?
Yeah, that's a super good question. I talked about the interview process a little bit. Part of what makes people good problem solvers is there's a whole bunch of personal characteristics about just who they are as people. And having a relaxed personality is something that you can train and get better at. Inoculation is one way to do it. But part of that is just personality traits too. Some people are more laid back than others. And that characteristic actually is a really good indicator of somebody that can be a good problem solver under stress. Because it's easy to be laid back when things are going well, but when you got a system that's down and a CIO is looking over your shoulder and the company's losing $1 million an hour while it's down, it can become very stressful. And so there's techniques you can learn to reduce that stress. Getting up and getting a cup of coffee while the CEO is looking over your desk, pretty hard thing to do, right? Because you've got a lot of pressure on you. But sometimes that's really the only way to break that bind that you're in, right? Because once your brain starts reacting with stress hormones, with cortisol, etc., basically you're cutting down to just the basic functions like breathing and running. The higher level functions stop functioning. And so you have to figure out a way to do that. And you guys have experienced that before too, right? How many times have you been had a problem you've been trying to solve for days, and you're taking a shower and all of a sudden the answer just pops in your head? That's a very common thing to happen to people. And that's partly because when your brain is the most relaxed is when some of those kinds of problems it's easiest for your brain to solve them. So anyway, but yeah, naturally relaxed person is going to be typically a better problem solver than somebody that is a little more uptight.
Yeah,
you mentioned
part of it is if you take it personally, so like, for example, if the system's down or something's not working, other people are in a panic. And for me, a lot of times I see it as an interesting problem, but I'm not like worried that I'm going to lose my job or something like that if it doesn't get solved right away, but you just dig in and you start figuring out what you can do to solve it.
Yeah. And there's another thing to remind yourself, to help relax, is that most of us don't work on life support systems. Very few of us do. occasionally we do, some people do, but most of us are working with business systems. And, you know, if you remind yourself, what's the worst thing that's going to happen? Nobody's going to die here, right? It's really about, you know, doing something good for the business, saving the business potentially, but nobody's going to die. You know, so that, you know, is also a technique you can use. What's the worst thing that's going to happen to me? You know, it's not the end of the world, right? You just got to work through it, right? So there's some little tricks you can play on your brain, you know, that way.
There's a really good trick somebody taught me when I was young, and if I could remember his name, I would love to say it. But he said, it goes to when you're doing something else, the answer will come to you, goes, write the question out in as much detail as you can, and then go wax your car or take a shower.
Yep. Part of that is the relaxing thing. There's a certain set of problems that are, they're focused. The way to solve them is to focus. If you're trying to calculate a long string of numbers, that's a focus problem. If you're trying to make an intuitive leap about some problem that you're trying to solve, that's something where you need to be relaxed. You need to, the other side of your brain needs to kick in. And so, yeah, absolutely. Taking a shower, taking a walk, getting a cup of coffee are good things to do to help open that up. There's other tricks for enabling parts of your brain, like writing it down. So you mentioned that, you know, if you get up on, that's why we tend to walk up to whiteboards when we're trying to solve problems, right? Because it opens up a whole different part of your brain, the visual part of your brain that is not usually used when you're sitting at a computer and typing. Verbalizing is another one of those things. So you've probably experienced this too, you know, you're trying to solve a problem, you're working. Somebody walks up behind you and says, well, what are you working on? And you say, well, I got this problem I'm trying to do. And the second you explain it, you know, you start explaining it to somebody, it's like, oh, I know how to solve that problem. It's because there's a different part of your brain that gets enabled in the verbal, you know, expression of it. Yeah. So collaborating with people, you know, is a very good technique. Writing things down on a board is a very good technique. There's lots of good techniques for opening up creative possibilities for solving problems.
Excellent. So I wanted to jump to the other question, and the tech industry can be unpredictable in terms of layoffs. Unfortunately, very common. How have you managed to stay relevant and thrive in this fast-paced industry? Do you have any insights you can share with our audience?
Yeah, I mean, I can share some thoughts on it. I am opinionated about almost everything. So the way to stay relevant, in my humble opinion, is to be learning something new every day. So one of the things I often would do in interview situations also is to, you know, ask people, what are you interested in? What are you excited about? You know, in both outside of work, but also inside work, right? And you know, if people would tell me, hey, you know, I really don't think about work outside of work. I really, you know, the only time I do think about work is when I'm there. That's usually not a real good sign, right? Because people that are that want to stay relevant, you know, they want to learn new stuff. And really, in the business that we're in, I think it's a requirement, right? So if you're not reading something, again, it doesn't always have to be like real pointed at what your job is, but something, you know, you need to be learning something, and all the time, really, if you want to be good at what we do and keep your brain sharp. So yeah, I think that's probably the main thing.
Mm-hmm.
I do think, you know, as we're all kind of in the DBA camp, you know, the administrative kind of camp, but I don't know if you guys have been developers in your background, or if you have been more focused on DBA kind of activities, but I spent most of my life, part of it doing development work early in my career. And that's sort of carried over, because as you're building tools for yourself in the administrative space or the tuning space, you know, you're brought back to that development mindset. And the world is turning more and more in that direction. So I think,
yeah, I was probably maybe in 20 or 25 years in the development area, and then maybe the past 10 or 15 years in pretty much just tuning, but all Oracle.
Actually, I remember that now that we had a conversation about some of the stuff that you'd built earlier in your career
Mhm.
in the tuning space. But yeah, it's anyway, the world I think is turning towards more of a development enabled and oriented space. So I think the things that are being automated are more in the administrative space and the management space and even in the tuning space. Whereas development is it's kind of like music, it's a creative process where you have a very rigid structure that you have to perform in or live in. You've got very fixed language, with very strict rules, like in music where you've got a key you have to stay in, but you have to figure out how to be creative within that, strict time and key sort of a time frame. So there's similar sort of thought processes. But I think that's more the direction that the industry's going, and that's harder to automate, because there is a very strong creative piece to that. Although we're, spending time all the time now thinking about AI and, can we write code? Can we have code writing code or translating code? There's lots of research being done in that area that's very interesting. But I still think the administrative stuff is much more likely to be automated than the development stuff.
Yep. Actually, I think that kind of ties into the next question, and that is, you're known for inspiring others. And I recently came across a quote of yours, focus on the data, not the database. So can you tell us a little bit more about your vision for focusing on the data rather than database? Is that still relevant? And what advice would you have for those just starting out in the industry?
Well, I don't remember saying that, by the way.
It was in Julian Donchev's blog.
Oh,
so
no telling what I was thinking when I said that, but what it makes me think of right now is that tuning a database is usually not nearly as effective as looking at the data and trying to figure out what it is you're trying to get out of the data. So often the approach is not turning some big knob in the database, setting some configuration parameter. That's number one, that's usually very risky because I'm potentially turning, making a change that could affect the whole thing, not just the one thing that I'm trying to fix. But number two, it's often not the best way to affect the change that you want to have happen. So the data, the way the data is laid out, the way it's distributed, the way it's accessed, really, if you turn your mind towards, what you want to get out of the system, and a lot of times that's just like, why am I doing extra work that I don't need to do? But if you focus on the data, generally, in my experience, I've been more successful focusing on the data and the access to the data rather than, the underlying system. How fast is my IO system, and how, efficient is my, my algorithm that I'm using to try to get the redo logs out as quickly as I can, et cetera.
All right. Excellent.
I don't know if that made sense or not. And I don't know if that's what I was thinking about when I said that, Julian.
Okay. Yeah, that was the bomb. I was gonna, we have a few bombs that we're gonna drop on you here today.
That actually made perfect sense to me, Kerry. But can I loop back on the AI, and specifically, I've been experimenting with ChatGPT, and then Google just released theirs. And one of the things I've been experimenting with is writing code, and it's actually very good at it. If you give it a very specific question, it says, I need code that will do A, B, C, and be very specific in this language.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. It doesn't write what I would call robust code, but it's a good, it's like, here's a quick framework. So I can see something like ChatGPT or other tools like that laying down initial frameworks that you have to be smart enough to go in and backfill it to make it more robust. What do you think about that?
Yeah, as an accelerator, I think you're absolutely right. We're to the point now where if you had to write an essay or a paper at work, white paper, you probably could get the framework of it written in fairly short order, and then spend your time editing, as opposed to facing, you guys know, the writer block of, I got a blank page sitting in front of me, I got to figure out what to write. If at least you got something to start with, a lot of times that's a huge accelerator. I will say, in the code aspect, it's harder to edit. And the reason I say that is because number one, it can be big and long and complex, for one thing. The second thing is you have a lot of competing priorities. You have technical accuracy, right? I've got to do this correctly and produce the right result. But you also have to worry about performance. How's this thing going to perform? And so there's a lot of considerations that you have to, it's got to be also readable. If you're going to leave it behind for somebody, it's got to be something that, somebody else could make sense out of when they see it. So, we're also experimenting with things like that. One of the things that, that I do at Google is work on translation of languages between different engines. This is a problem that we worked on at Gluent for a long time, and have continued working on at Google. And in that regard, it's, to get something that can perform in real time. So we're talking milliseconds, if not less, to do a translation. It's very highly dependent on performance, which means it becomes very, very specialized in how you implement it. And also, we're not, we have an interesting set of data to train it with. We're not trying to use the English language to say, I want you to write a program that, does X, Y, Z in English, right? What I'm really doing is I'm saying, I've got this in this dialect of Java. I want to translate this into Python or some other, language. And so I have to make sure that syntactically it's correct. That's number one goal. But number two goal is, all these other sideline things. Is it readable? Is it, performant? Is it elegant? Even. And so, where my brain is right now is that the idea of a large language model where you've got, thousands of examples of a way to write something that is syntactically equivalent to something in another language, I don't think is probably the right approach. I think a curated set of examples where that Adrian Billington wrote these two, and therefore you have a high level of confidence that those are very well done, very, are going to be performant, and are, going to be probably the best examples that we're going to get. Whereas if I've got thousands of examples and I don't have a way of ranking those, it becomes difficult for the model to figure out what's a good one, what's not a good one. I don't think we've got any models yet that really are smart enough to be able to, take alternatives and say, well, this one's going to perform better, this one's more legible or whatever. I don't think we're to that degree yet.
Yeah, actually, one of my comments on Chat GPT, and I've used it quite a bit, and I've seen other people use it, and they asked questions something like, if I wanted to update some record or something along those lines, what would this look like in PL SQL? And so Chat GPT gives them this long PL SQL program, and I'm thinking to myself, that really, and it's doing this single row at a time update. So, technically it works, it does the thing, but the design aspect of that Chat GPT isn't really criticizing that. It's not saying, well, really, you should just do this in one SQL statement, not a PL SQL loop.
Yeah, it's a hard problem, man. And again, I don't, maybe at some point we'll be trying to describe in English, what we want to happen. But there's a way more precise way to describe that to the computer that what you want it to do. Right. So even if I was going to explain it in English, I probably would use words like select and, here's the columns that I want to select. And, because there's a more precise way to say it than just, I want to write up, something that updates this table with a new value for a phone number. Right. Anyway, we're in this phase of trying to figure out where this thing is going to be really valuable and where it's not. I have no doubt that eventually AI will be writing most of our code for us. And part of my fear is that we'll be in the business of doing this ranking. If I got to read code and say, yeah, that's a good one and that's not a good one. And that doesn't sound like nearly as much fun as writing the code to begin with. So I don't know how many of us are going to want to sign up for that job to train the models. Does that make sense?
So you hinted, I think, a little bit about how Gluent works, and it's a very impressive product. But I guess my understanding is that you can write your app. Well, you have your application in your sort of native language, the origin application, but then Gluent will translate that into the language of the big data, where the big data lives. So is that what you're talking about when you're talking about the language translation?
Yeah. So, I mean, you can think of different SQL dialects, or, Java to Python, or PL SQL to Java, those kinds of translations, right? Where you've got some requirement to be like, if I go to BigQuery, I don't have, or Spanner, I don't really have a procedural language built into the database. So if I've got procedural language that's written in Java or Python, or, PL SQL, even in Oracle, I have to translate that into something that's more generic and not a PL SQL-like language that's embedded in the database. So that's one of the things that, one of the problems that we're tackling. And at Gluent, it was a real-time thing. Now, there's different degrees of real-time, right? If we're doing analytic queries, we're not trying to do things in, microseconds. We're trying to do things in sub-second, is generally fine for analytic kind of queries, because they're typically longer running SQL statements. So we had a little more flexibility in that space than we would have in a transactional system. So in that space, it's usually batch oriented, right? We're going to run a big, I'll use the word corpus, a big bunch of SQL or code, through a translation utility, and then take that out. And we also have a chance to pretty it up or improve the performance on it, or make it look better than whatever is spit out by a translation, whether it's an AST, syntax tree based sort of translation, or it's an AI based translation.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, the Gluent definitely sound like a really cool thing, and I guess you've given us a little bit of a glimpse into your current projects. Is there anything else you'd like to or be able to share with us about your, what's exciting about your current projects?
I don't know what all I'm not supposed to talk about, but in general, what I'll say about, I'm really enjoying working at Google. So, I've spent most of my life being my own boss, which is, there's pluses and minuses with that. The amount of control you've got is certainly nice, but the amount of responsibility that comes along with that is also, a lot of pressure sometimes. And so there's pluses and minuses to that kind of a trade-off. One of the things that I really like about Google is that, the day you show up, they tell you, hey, we don't want you doing your job all the time. We want you to make sure you spend 20% of your time not doing your job. That may sound kind of silly, but basically what they're saying is, we want you to spend 20% of your time working on whatever excites you, whatever, makes your brain light up. And if you think there's some value of that to the company, to Google, then go work on that and spend 20% of your time doing that, and go recruit your buddies, Roger and whoever, to come and work on that with you that are other employees of Google. So it's kind of an interesting environment because of that. So.
A couple questions here from the audience. One, Gary says, "Hey, Kerry."
Hi, Gary.
And the other one is from Michael. Will companies be running Siebel, SAP, PeopleSoft, and EBS 20 years from now? The code is older than dirt. Yeah.
Probably. I think we probably still got some COBOL systems running, and you know,
I was
there's definitely,
supporting a COBOL system a couple years ago.
yeah. So
Mhm.
yeah, I have no doubt that, you know, there will still be people running, you know, traditional stuff 20 years from now. It will decrease. You guys have seen it already, you know, decrease, but
Mhm.
at some point, what really ends up shutting it down is that there's no more operating systems old enough to run the code. And so then you're forced to, you know, to do something different, right? So we still occasionally get into a situation where we've got a database that we don't have an operating system for anymore, and we have to go hunting around to find, you know, an old version of an IBM operating system or whatever to get it to come up, even for a backup. You know, I've seen that happen as well.
Yeah.
You brought up working for yourself. I worked for myself for 30 years. I loved it. If you were to talk to somebody, either one coming out of university or maybe getting laid off, about starting their own business, starting their own consulting firm, what one piece of advice would you give them?
Oh man, I don't think it could be just one piece of advice.
All right, make it three, top three.
But probably, man, it would be to do a hard self-evaluation, you know, about your personality and your tolerance for risk, and your really, it's probably about your tolerance for risk, because you know there are great things about working for yourself. There's also a lot of pressure, you know, because you're the, you know, you're the guy that if we don't make money this month, you're the one that doesn't have money to pay your rent, right? So so yeah, there's a lot of pressure that comes with that. On the other hand, there's, you know, a lot of uh, flexibility and a lot of ability to do things to control, you know, your environment and the way things happen around you. So I don't think it's for everybody. I think there's a lot of people that it's probably not a good fit for. Um, and I'll give you one example. You know, in the past, I've hired people out of the military, and in general, my philosophy of work and business is that, you know, people should be pretty self-directed, right? I don't believe in a real hierarchical structure where, you know, the boss tells you what to do and then you tell your subordinate what to do, and everybody, you know, has this very hierarchical sort of approach to things. I really believe in a culture where everybody has a very strong degree of self-determination and does the things that they think are the most valuable to the organization. It can't be 100%. And if there's any downside to Google, you know, Google is so self-directed, you know, that it ends up causing, it's a bit chaotic sometimes, right? Now, the trade-off for that is that you have probably an ideal situation for innovation, right? Because you got multiple people, you know, all coming up with new ideas and new ways to approach it and recruiting their buddies. And, you know, so innovation is, you know, through the roof. But it also means it's a little less organized and a little bit more chaotic than a more organized, you know, kind of company. Accenture is a much more organized company, right? It's, you know, from the top, they say, this is what we're going to do, and we go do it. And, you know, so efficiency is very high, but, you know, it's a different kind of approach. So anyway, my approach is more like Google's. It's more self-directed. And so when we would hire people that came from a very structured environment, like the military, for example, uh, sometimes those guys could not, it just didn't fit well with their personality. If you understand what I'm saying, you know, they would come in and they would say, you know, I'm uncomfortable because I don't know what I should be working on. Nobody's telling me what I should be working on. And so I'm not sure that I'm doing the right thing. And so sometimes those guys would not stay very long at the company because they're uncomfortable. You know, just
Mhm.
the culture is uncomfortable to them. So I don't know
Well,
how I even
there's
got
probably also the fear of making a mistake.
exactly right. And so that, you know, so for that, somebody who's used to being in that kind of environment, and there's probably personality traits associated with it too. You know, being an entrepreneur, you know, is maybe not the best choice, right? There may be better in an organization that's more structured. That is the way I would say it. And this is not to say somebody's not, you know, ideal person because they are more structured. It's just really a personality trait. And some of the smartest guys I know, some of the best creative problem solvers I know, are very structured. And so for those people, you know, being an Incotech was not a good fit. You know, we had really great guys that, you know, came in and didn't stay very long because it was uncomfortable. They weren't comfortable in that very unstructured kind of an environment. So that's no judgment, you know, it's good or bad. It's just, you know, people are different. And again, entrepreneurs need to be a little bit more comfortable with, you know, what's the word? Lack of certainty, you know, with uncertainty and, you know, a little bit of chaos, right? Because that's kind of the way it is when you're running a business. So.
Yeah, that's always been a big one for me, is the uncertainty. But I thrive on that. However, like my wife is a CPA. These are the rules. We will follow the rules, and everything is in its place. She is perfect in that environment.
Yeah.
And I'm not.
So a partnership like that often, you know, makes it possible for somebody to be in a less structured environment, right? Because you've got structure, you've got a steady partner that, you know, lives that kind of life mentally, and that gives you freedom, you know, to have a different approach. So that often is the case as well.
And somebody anonymous says, at what point do you say you are ready to retire? Me, never, never.
That's a good question. You know, I'm definitely old enough. So, yeah, I don't know, man. Some of us, I may never retire. It's like, you know, I enjoy what I do. I love working with people. I also hate working with people sometimes because, you know, people don't do what you tell them to do, whereas computers do exactly what you tell them to. And so, not that I want to tell people what to do, but it is nice to be able to type something and have exactly what you typed happen, even if you know, don't describe well what you want to have happen. And then, you know, you get bugs and things that don't work well. But yeah, it's, yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
I used to say I love the programming because the computer does exactly what I tell it to do. That's the good part. The bad part, the computer does exactly what I tell it to do.
That's exactly the case. And so, yeah. The great thing about working with people, though, is that, you know, they can way exceed your expectations. So, you know, you can help put somebody on a path or give them a little bit of direction, and with no idea, you know, where they're going to take that thing. With a computer program, pretty much, you know, it's going to do, like you say, what you tell it to do. People are very different. Now, sometimes you get disappointed too, but for the most part, you know, I'm a firm believer in the positive nature of human beings. And, you know, I believe that, you know, most people want to do the right thing, and that given the opportunity, you know, people will far exceed what you expect out of them. So.
I think this ties into my next question, and I imagine a bit of your success is related to your ability to connect with C-band executives as well as your typical tech person. So could you tell us a little bit about how you've managed to excel in both arenas, and what advice you would have for others looking to do the same?
Yeah, communication is like super important, right? And so all the way back to the recruiting thing, you know, finding a really smart guy with a high IQ that's got a good technical background, even if they're good at solving problems, you know, communication skills is right up there at the top of the list of characteristics that are important, right? Because it doesn't matter if you're the smartest guy in the room, if you can't convince the other people in the room, and oftentimes that includes leadership people. It doesn't matter if you're the smartest guy and you got the best idea if you can't convince people that that's the right thing to do. And so there's a lot that plays into that, but I'll tell you a story. In my first decade, the first decade when I was doing computer work, pretty early on, I became, this Oracle guy pretty early. Like my first job out of college, they handed me a manual. And so we got this little bitty Oracle manual. It's about, half an inch thick, and, read this and see what you think we ought to do with it. And pretty soon I got decent with it. And so I submitted a paper to speak at a conference. They were starting to have the Oracle, the annual Oracle conference thing. And lo and behold, I got accepted. And so I was ready to go and do the talk. And when it came right down to it, I was too scared to go and speak in public. So it was like the number one fear I had in life, right? There wasn't too many things that scared me, but speaking in public was one of them. And so, I asked another guy who was a little older than me to go and, do the talk for me, and he did. And, I still remember that, right? This is a long time since then, several decades. And so that obviously had an effect on me. And I spent a lot of time training myself, trying to learn how to be a good communicator, including being in front of audiences. And so I signed up for a Toastmasters club, and I used to go in once a week and do a speech. And, that got me better in front of a small group. And then I took a job teaching. So I was, and eventually I started writing classes and teaching classes. But that's really where I started to become a decent communicator, because you'd have to stand up for 8 hours a day for a week at a time, talking to a group of people. And eventually, the way you get better at anything is practice. So the more I practiced, the better I got at it. And that's, I don't think I'm particularly good, by the way, at communicating with CTO, CIO, C-level people. I do have, because have run a couple of companies, I've got at least some way to relate to that, but I really relate a whole lot better to technical people. So if I'm in a room with a bunch of technical people, I have no problem whatsoever communicating. If I'm in a room with, a CTO and a CIO, I'm a lot more uncomfortable. So I can do it, but I don't think I'm, all that great at it. And I'm certainly not comfortable doing it. So. But the important thing is you can get better if you practice it, and communication is super important for everything we do, regardless of, even if we're a heads down programmer, you can have the best ideas in the world, but if you can't get them across to people, you're not gonna, make a real difference in the world. So.
That's right. Yep. We did have a couple of, not that many questions from the Anctech folks at Accenture, but Garo did say, ask him what he thinks about salespeople, because he recalled when he first started with Anctech that Abdul and Kerry, he said Abdul and Kerry would ask me every day if I sold anything.
Well, I have a long history as a sales guy. So, I've, in my career, it's gotten to the point now where mainly what I am is a sales guy. So I have changed my opinion of that, but I have high expectations of everybody that I work with, right? I really expect a lot. I expect a lot out of myself, and I expect a lot out of the technical guys around me, and I expect a lot out of the sales guys too. And sales guys are, generally speaking, are not as used to, having somebody pointedly, talk to them like that, Like if I came in and said, Roger, what did you get done today? Did you get that bug fixed that we've been working on? You would tell me, you would say, no, I didn't get it fixed. Here's why. I'm working on this thing, and I ran into this roadblock, and, tomorrow I'm going to work on this thing, and, we're going to get it resolved. Sales guy would say, I got 8 things in the pipeline, and, this one's going to come through. They would tell a whole story about, where they want to go. Now, the good news about that is if they're not optimistic and they can't tell you that kind of story, they're probably not going to be a very good sales guy. So you want that, that kind of personality trait out of those guys, but they're also not really used to that generally speaking, to that kind of pointed communication that technical guys tend to have, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's why I say, I'm not as comfortable talking to a CTO or a CIO who often come up in a, more business oriented, often a sales oriented sort of background. And so a guy, being very pointed and saying, where are we on this thing that we got to get fixed, is not always the best communication style with those guys. So anyway, I've gotten better at it over the years, but it's not my strongest suit.
I heard the glimpse of a war story. Maybe you might recall this one. Somebody mentioned about a large armored car company, and their database was down, and the database tracked where the trucks were, that type of thing. Do you recall this war story?
I recall the customer, and I recall working on it. I don't know specifically what the war story was, but yeah, it's a big armored car company. You know, the one starts with a B. And yeah, we got called in to fix a performance problem. And the performance problem was that they had this job that they ran. I forget what the frequency was, every 10 minutes or something like that. And it did exactly what you said. It would tell them where their trucks were. And so when I got there, they said, we want you to come in at night. Can you come in at 10 p.m.? Because we want to work on this thing overnight when, the trucks are not out running around, and see if we can get this thing fixed. So I show up at, 10 o'clock, and they sit me down at the computer and they say, okay, here I'm going to show you the daily job. And this is the one we're having the problems with. And I said, okay, how often does this run? They said, every 10 minutes. And I said, I'm going to ignore the fact that you call it the daily job, but let's just move on to what's going on with this thing. And they said, well, it runs every 10 minutes and it takes about an hour to run. And I said, that doesn't sound like it's going to work. And they said, no, it's not. We have no idea where our money is. And it's like a real problem because the banks, they want to be able to say, yeah, this guy picked up my money at my ATM and he's, halfway to the bank or whatever. So anyway, yeah, that was the system. I don't remember what the war story was in terms of what we had to do or why we went about it, but it was an interesting problem. And it was a performance problem. And so we used basically the MILSAP method R kind of method. This was a long time ago. So we were tracing things to see, where the time was going. And I don't really recall what the problem was or, what we had to do to fix it, but something in that process was not working anywhere near what it should be.
Mm-hmm. But ultimately,
Yeah.
you fix it. That's the good thing.
Yeah. We got it fixed that night, but there was a long history with those guys. We worked with those guys for 10 years because of that success on that one thing. We ended up working with them for another decade, on all kinds of stuff. And they did.
Yeah, I can see a problem right there. A job runs every 10 minutes and it takes an hour to run.
Yeah. Something's got to give here. Something's got to be different. So.
Yeah, I remember I was on one system where it took, what was it, 96 hours to load 24 hours of data because somebody pumped a whole lot of code in the front end.
Yeah, you just get a little further behind every day, right? You're never going to catch up. So.
I won't tell what government agency that was with, but it doesn't start with a T.
Not the Treasury Department.
No, it does not start with T.
All right. The believe it or not, Kerry, I was surprised to get access.
What else can I tell you?
Oh, go for it.
No, I was just saying, what else did you want to talk about?
Well, I got access denied message when I tried to visit kerryosborne.oracleguide.com from my Eccentric computer. So it may need to be scanned for malware.
I scanned it. Scan your site.
Is it okay?
Scan your site.
Or you're telling me I should scan my site?
Yeah, get a malware guy to scan your site.
Yeah, I have only posted one thing in the last 2 or 3 years. So
it doesn't matter.
Yeah, it's not.
It doesn't matter.
It's still a good resource. So I'm asking Accenture to open up your website as a required reference source for the job. So
Okay, I'll scan it.
That's the best piece of advice I can give you. Um,
I'm
let's
still
see.
interested. I'm still interested in those boomerangs. I think when I was a kid, I had a boomerang and I threw it and it just like went, it never came back. So
Well, let's just pull one off the wall and see what it looks like.
Please don't throw it
No,
in
I'm
the
not gonna-
house.
This is this is not a returning boomerang. This is like would be called a hunting stick, I guess. And a guy in Australia made these two for me out of mulga wood, I think. So yeah, these things, they're shaped like an airplane wing basically. And this one is not meant to turn around. The ones that turn around generally are much more curved, and you throw them kind of this like up and down, and they fail over the way after a while, and they come hovering back. But this one, it's just going to lay over and it's going to fly for 100, 150 yards in pretty much a straight line, maybe slightly curved, but not much.
so they
And
take out small game with that.
Yeah. Or break a leg,
Well, we normally go for about an hour, and normally towards the end, we give the guest an opportunity to give his coordinates, how people can get in touch with you or follow you. Let's say we do have had your Twitter handle up there.
Yep.
And your
LinkedIn or
website as
Twitter's, probably the easiest way to get a hold of me. So
well.
I'm
Okay.
pretty easy to find. So I'm surprised that I should try to get to my own blog and see if I can get to it from my Google laptop, because they're pretty security conscious as well.
Now I remember that, so I put this little animation together because I remember that Enkatech, you remember telling the story that Enkatech came out of the name Enkatech came out of the word necktie. And since nobody was wearing neckties there, then you came up with the word Enkatech.
Actually, there's a slightly longer version of that story. We hired a marketing guy when Wade and I decided we were going to start this company. We hired a marketing guy to help us name it, and so he came in, and we'd met with him a couple of times. But the day he was coming in to like present names to us, he had a new pair of glasses on, and I said, "Oh man," I said, "those glasses look fantastic." And I said, "They're, you look really smart in those glasses." And he got a funny look on his face. And I said, "Oh, come on, man. Wait a minute. Don't tell me you don't really need those glasses." And he said, "No, I don't." He said, "I just wear them to make me look smart." And I said, "You are the perfect marketing guy." So you got a job here for as long as you want it.
You are.
But anyway, he came up with a few names, and the only real criteria was that it wasn't taken on the internet. And Enkatech was one of them. And we didn't have any idea, that it stood for anything. It didn't stand for anything when we picked it. But somebody figured out that it was an anagram for necktie. We rearranged the letters, it spelled necktie, which we thought was funny because we didn't wear, nobody wore neckties at Enkatech. So it was just a happenstance that, that was the letters that we used.
Oh, neat. Interesting.
Yeah.
All right. Kerry, thank you very much for spending time with us.
No problem.
I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Really good to talk to you guys.
Yeah, this was
Yeah,
good.
you should come. You should come on back.
I don't think that's going to happen right now. Maybe later.
Okay.
Hey, I actually have one quick thing to relate. When I first started or interviewing at Enkatech with the Enkatech group, Martin Painter was there, so I had a conversation with him, and I had previously suffered from like imposter syndrome a little bit, right? And but then I got over that, and I was like, more confident, that type of thing. And then in the conversation, Martin says to me, "Well, at Enkatech, we have 100 Rogers." And I was like insulted. I was like, wait a minute. I thought I was unique. But then I started working here. I was like, yeah, they have 100 Rogers plus, I mean, the group that at Enkatech, I found to be very top notch, willing to help out, if we have the email distribution list. If you have a question, almost immediately you'll get some answers, very high quality answers from folks and stuff like that. So it is a pleasure to work with such a high caliber group, and you had a big hand in building that group. So appreciate it too.
Yeah. Well, I would never say such a thing, by the way, because everybody is unique. Everybody has, I like to say it's like you got a set of rose-colored glasses, right? And depending on your experiences through life, everybody sees things through a slightly different color, right? And so there's no two people that are alike, regardless of how similar their backgrounds were, how similar their cultures were. Everybody's unique. And that's what makes a team good at solving problems, right? This is another thing that if you want to solve more problems, having more viewpoints on that problem, and the more unique they can be in every aspect, in culture, in background, in what they worked on, and having a networking guy and a DBA and a developer, all looking at the same problem. That's really important, but also the diverse backgrounds also, adds to that, because we have all these cultural biases and things that we're not aware of as well. So anyway, I would never say we got 100 Rogers, because we don't. Everybody's different. So, and you're there for a reason, because they needed a guy just like you at the time that you got hired.
All right. Well, thanks for that encouragement.
Yep.
I got one more question from Gary. What's the strat neck back there hanging from a hook?
I thought this would be, I had an extra guitar neck. I'm a guitar player, and I decided to put the bathroom key on it, because in the gas stations they always have a big thing, so you can't get away with the key to the bathroom. So I put it on a guitar neck.
That's a good place to put a bathroom key.
Well, this is the bathroom, so
I'm gonna have to borrow that trick.
nobody stole it so far, so I'm happy with my solution.
All right.
And it's not a strap; it's a Paul Reed Smith. Just in case anybody knows or cares.
All right. Well, thank you so much, and you have a great rest of your week and weekend.
Thanks. Really
Take
good
care.
to see you. Like I said, we should do this again. We don't have to video it, but
I say we
up.
do this again, catch up.
Yep.
All right.
I wouldn't say on the video. All right.
Take care, guys. Yep.
All right. See y'all. Bye.
Bye-bye.